Hello and welcome to another Minecraft Bedrock Edition add-on making tutorial with me, FoxyNoTail. And before we get started, I just want to remind you that everything we discuss in this series is available on my website. Go to foxynotail.com/how-to to get all of the resources, the downloads of the packs, access to the software, and everything else that we discuss. You can also watch all of the videos on there in order, which is pretty handy. Anyway, enough of me talking about my website. Let's talk about what we're going to be getting into today, and that is to create an entity. So what entity are we going to make? Well, we're going to make one that I've already made and one that's been broken for a little while. If you're aware of my channel and my series, you'll maybe know about an add-on I put out quite a while ago called Chunk Loader or Chuck Loader, which was an add-on of an in-game pet or sort of player type thing that was a chunk loader and would also sleep the night away for you and do a bunch of other useful things as well. Now, unfortunately, that pack has been broken since Minecraft 1.16 and I've been getting quite a lot of messages asking me to fix it. So this is the perfect opportunity for us to learn about entities because that one has got quite a lot of basic things in it and more complex things as well. So today we're going to start at the beginning with the basic side of things, making the model, making the textures, and making the basic components that make it an entity. So that's what we're going to be focusing on in today's episode, and then moving on to the more advanced features later on, which will enable Chuck to be able to do all of the things that he wants to do, or that we want him to do. So let's get started. Okay, so we're back in Visual Studio Code and I have two folders ready like we set up in the last video, ready for adding in our files. We've got Entity B and Entity R, one for the resource pack and one for the behavior pack, and we've set those up in a workspace in Visual Studio Code, which if you want to know how to do that and you haven't already checked out my previous two videos, then check out my previous two videos because that's basically what we did. Anyway, let's get cracking. The first thing we're going to need is an entity file in our behavior pack to determine what the entity is. And we're going to copy and paste it from the vanilla Minecraft files. Again, go back to the first video if you want to know how to access these files. We're going to go into the data, then behavior packs, and we're going to go into vanilla 1.16.100 because that's got recently new entities in there. And we're just going to grab a random entity. We want one relatively similar to a player, and any of these will do. It really doesn't mind. Now, if there's anything in particular that you want your entity to do, which is similar to a Minecraft one, then you could copy and paste those. But for us, it really doesn't matter because we're going to be pretty much starting from scratch. Now, there is a player one, which is obviously for the player that we could copy and paste, but that's got stuff in there that's not really relative to an entity. So I'm just going to grab this one here called NPC, which is actually an entity that is used in Minecraft Adventure Maps and the Education Edition as well. So I'm going to right click it, I'm going to hit copy. I'm going to scroll up, I'm going to go to my Entity B folder. First thing I'm going to do is make a new folder called Entities. I'm going to right click that folder and hit paste, and now we've got our very own NPC file right there. Now you can see the format version is 1.13. We're actually working in 1.16, so let's change that to 1.16. And the identifier is Minecraft NPC. Now this Minecraft we cannot use. That is reserved just for the Minecraft files. If we use Minecraft, this is what's known as a namespace. If we use Minecraft, the game's going to say, hey, you can't do that because that's ours. Make your own one. And I'm just going to use FNT, which is obviously short for FoxyNoTail. The shorter it is, the easier it is to remember. Now, I would avoid using ones that are single letter like A, B, C, D, E, something like that, because other people are probably going to use those as well. Go for something short and easy to remember. So the identifier namespace is FNT, but what should we actually identify our entity as? What's going to be unique about this entity? Well, we're actually going to be basing this entity off my alt account, which is Chuck Loader, which is a joke on Chunk Loader because that's his job. And that's what we're going to call it. We're going to call it Chuck. So we know that this entity is Chuck. Now, we've got is spawnable. That's set to true. That means we can spawn it in from a spawn node. If we put that on false, we wouldn't be able to get a spawn egg for it. Is summonable is also true, which means we can use the summon command to generate one in the world, which is useful. And is experimental is set to false, which means we don't need experimental mode to use it. So we're going to leave those as they are, and then we're going to dig down into these components, and you can see there's all sorts of junk here that we don't need. So we're pretty much going to rip most of it out. Now, damage sensor we don't need right now. We do want the type family. We don't need fire immune. We don't need movement right now or loot. We do want collision box because that is going to be basically what Chuck's collision box is, the way that we click on him or interact with him, or the way he can't, or the way he bumps into things. We're going to get rid of this behavior look at players. We will be adding things like that in later on, but we don't need it right now. We're going to keep persistent. That means he's always going to be persistent in the world. He's not going to disappear. And we're going to get rid of this Minecraft type NPC because that's nothing to do with us. We're going to take nameable away as well because we don't want him to be renamed, but we are going to give him physics, which means he will have gravity and collisions. Now we can turn collisions off, which means he's not going to bang into other entities, but if you do that, it will also sink through the floor, which isn't ideal. So we're going to leave that as it is. And then this last one is Minecraft Conditional Bandwidth Optimization, which is a brand new thing they added in 1.16, which attempts to basically make entities more optimized and less laggy in your world. So we're going to save that, and we're going to rename this entity file, and we're going to call it Chuck. And then that's the same as our identifier there. So we've got our entity Chuck. We've now created an entity which we will be able to summon in the world. However, right now it would be completely invisible. We wouldn't be able to see it because it doesn't have a body. It's got no model. It's got no textures, and it's got no controllers to actually generate it in a within the world visually. So before we go running off into the resource pack and leaving this behind, let's actually concentrate a bit more about what makes up this entity file. Now you can see we've got the description section at the top. We've been through that. That's universal across all of the different entities, so we'll leave that alone. But what comes below that is completely configurable based on what you're creating. We've got a group here, or we've got a section called components. If we minimize that, you can see all of these things here are inside components. But there's more things as well, such as events, which will allow us to trigger certain things and change our components. And then another one called component groups, which allow us to have different variations of this same entity. If we look at a wolf, you can see we've got component groups. We've got the Minecraft wolf when it's a baby, which has its own set of components, like our main components, those telling it how big it is, the fact that the game it says it's a baby, and the fact that it can grow up and be fed things to age it. We've also got the wolf adult, which basically determines what the wolf will do when it's an adult and how it will be different from when it's a baby. We've also got the wolf when it's angry, how the wolf changes, how it then starts to target things, and all of the components required to control that wolf when it's angry. We've got the difference between a wild wolf and a tame wolf, and we've also got the abilities in there to tame them. So they're different component groups, which basically say when this wolf is in this particular mode, whether it's a wolf, whether it's angry or a baby or an adult or wild or tame, it will take on these particular components. And those components are exactly the same as ones we've got in our main components list and the ones that we can get from our bedrock.dev wiki or website, which has got all of the different components in the game that you can add to your entities. Now, not all entities can have all of those components, but most of them can have most of them, which is kind of a bit weird. Anyway, so our main components are overwritten by the things in component groups. Now, we're getting a little bit technical and a little bit advanced now. We're not covering this in today's topic, but I'm just going to go over it briefly so that when we do come to cover those things in a later episode, you'll have a little bit more of an idea of what we're talking about. So these component groups are great, but how do you actually tell that entity to go from being a baby to an adult, or to go from being tame to being angry, or from being wild to being tame? And that's all to do with interactions and events. If we look at the wild wolf component group, you'll see in here that we've got something called tameable. And then when you tame something using a bone, that's the tame items, then you've got an event that triggers. And this event, all of the events are listed below our components. So if we make that small again to get it out of the way and make our component small, you'll see underneath we've then got a whole list of all of the different events that can occur on a wolf. So the first one is entity spawned. That's basically when the game spawns one in naturally, it's going to randomize, is this wolf going to be a wild wolf or a wild adult wolf, or is it going to be a wild baby wolf? It's saying there's a 1 in 10 chance of it being a baby, otherwise it's going to be an adult. So that's when it's being spawned in. The next one is entity born. So when you breed two wolves together, then it's going to be a tame baby wolf. That's the only thing it can be. You've also got the event when it's growing up, ageable, and then the one that we were looking at is on tame. So when it's being tamed, it's saying get rid of the wild wolf component group and add in the tame wolf component groups. So when you tame a wolf, going back to these component groups, it's going to get rid of this wild one here, and it's going to replace all of the things inside there with the tame one. And you'll see the main difference here is the wild one can be tamed. The tame one will no longer have the ability to be tamed because it's also tamed, and now it takes on the ability to follow its owner. It will be given an owner, and it will be able to follow those. So there's all sorts of things that we can do with these components and component groups. Now we're just focusing on the components. We're not adding any events. We're not adding any groups in right now. We're going to do that later on, but we do need to focus on what does exist within those components so that our entity behaves naturally the way we want it to. So first of all, we've got type family, which basically defines what families this entity comes from. So it can be part of multiple families, it can be part of just one family. So it's already in the mob category. We can also put it in the hostile mob category, so it's counted as a hostile mob, or we could put it in, well, let's check some out. What is a cow? So a cow is in the family of cows, and it's also in the family of mobs. Whereas an armor stand, for instance, is in the family armor stands, inanimate, which means it's not an actual mob, it's an inanimate entity, and mob as well. You'll see projectiles like arrows don't have a family, but then if we go to a boat, you'll see that the family is boats and also inanimate. Inanimate basically means it's an object rather than like an alive entity or something like that. Drowns, for instance, are drowns and zombies and undead and monsters and mobs. So you can kind of see what the game's doing here. Monsters means the game treats it as a hostile mob. Undead means that it will burn in the daylight and it will do other things that undead mobs do, like sink in water rather than trying to swim. It also says it's part of the zombie group, and the mob just means it's not an inanimate, it is like a living, breathing creature. So coming back to Chuck, let's have a look at the family. Well, yes, he does fit into the mob category because he's sort of a living, breathing thing. He's not an inanimate, he's not hostile, and I guess he is an NPC, which stands for non-playable character, so we're going to leave that exactly like it is. Now the next important one is the collision box, and we've got the width of the entity and the height of the entity. So bearing in mind, Chuck's going to have a player model. He's going to look like a player, so he's going to be wider than he is thin, and he's going to have height. Now the problem with these collision boxes is they have to have the same width on both sides. So we either need to make Chuck's collision box fit him widthways, so he fully fits into it, but then it would be too wide for him front and back, which means he would never be able to get particularly close to a wall, or we squish it so that his arms can go inside of walls and they'll clip through blocks and things like that, but his collision box is on the inside, so it meets him on the front and back. I hope that makes sense. It's a very difficult one to visualize, but yeah, we've only got width. We don't have width and depth and height, which is kind of weird. We've only got 2 dimensions for the collision box when we're working in a 3D game. But height 2.1 is the block height, so basically from 0 to 2. Now, Chuck's going to be 2 blocks tall, so we'll put that on 2. And width-wise, well, we'll worry about that when we actually get to the model. So what other things do we want Chuck to be able to do? Well, when we first created Chuck, we actually deleted a behavior that was called look at player. And look at player is quite a good one. Look at player means that your entity will move its head, providing you've determined that it's got a head, towards the closest player to it, which gives it a little bit of life and makes it not quite so static and flat in your world. So if we go to bedrock.dev, Minecraft look at player, it tells us all of the different things that we can add to that. We've got how long it will look there, the probability of it looking a player, and all of the angles of views and things like that as well. We don't need much of that in there, and we can add this in. Now we know that this is a Minecraft namespace, and we can just basically copy and paste that in there. So I'm going to come below my collision box, and then I'm going to put some quotes in and paste it between there. And then I'm going to do a semicolon after that, and a brace, and hit return. So everything I type in here now is being typed within that component. So first thing I'm going to add is the probability. Now you can see it's already giving me a list of all of the different things I can add, because again, I'm using an extension. I've got all sorts of extensions. You can see a list of all the ones I'm using on my website, which allow me to create add-ons a little bit more quickly and efficiently. So I'm going to type in probability, and it's automatically going to put in 0.2, which is the default if we look over here. Now I don't want it to be 2 because that's actually 2%, which isn't very regularly. I want him to look at the player more regular than he looks at other things. So I'm going to put in a probability of 0.5, which is a 50% chance he's going to decide to look at a player. I'm then going to copy and paste that entire component And then I'm going to put in the behavior, a couple of behaviors down, look at entity, which means that maybe a rabbit will walk past Chuck, or a wolf, or a different entity in the game. Chuck could decide to look at that instead. And that means that Chuck is going to either decide to look at a player or an entity. But what if we want Chuck to just look around randomly and just sort of explore his surroundings? There is a component to that. If you type in the search box up here, random, you'll see we've got an AI goal, Minecraft behavior, random look around. And if we click on that, we can also add this into Chuck as well. So we're going to come down from our last component, hit the quote keys, and we're going to do Minecraft, and we're going to do behavior, random, look around. And we're going to leave that blank because it's already got the defaults. We don't need to add any settings in there. We could change the amount of time he looks around, but we're not. But he's never going to pick that now because we've told him the probability is already at 1. So we're going to reduce the probabilities of both of these to 3. So we've got a 30% chance of looking at the player, 30% chance of looking at an entity, and a 30% chance of randomly looking around. Now, what else do we want Chuck to be able to do? Now, we probably don't want Chuck to be completely invulnerable. We want him to have health, and we want him to be able to take damage. So we're going to create a new component. We're going to call it Minecraft Health. And we're going to put 2 values in here. We're going to have max, which is the max health he can have. And we're going to put in 20, which is the same as a player. So 20 health points is the same as 10 hearts. Each heart has 2 health points, which is why you can have half a heart. And then we're going to put in the value, and that's how much health he's going to start with, at 20 as well. So he's going to start with his maximum health. So now Chuck will be able to take damage, and after he's taken 20 hit points, he will die. We probably want him to be able to like burn in lava, I guess. So if we look at the bat, for instance, you'll see it's got a hurt on condition. And that says that if it is in lava, it's going to take damage. So I'm going to copy that entire component with Control-C, go back to Chuck, and I'm just going to paste that down here below our random look around behavior. And now when Chuck is in lava, he's going to take damage. So that's all we're going to add in for now. We're not going to make him walk around or follow us or anything just yet. We're just adding in these basic components just to make him feel a little bit lifelike, but we're not doing any animation stuff, so he's not going to be able to walk just yet. We'll do that probably in the next video. So now that we've got our entity file all sorted out, we're going to save it. However, can you see it's red and there is a 1 next to it at the top? And you can see here there is a wiggly underlined of value. That is because I forgot to put a comma between max and value. So we're going to come over to another program called Blockbench, which is absolutely fantastic. And we're going to go with a Bedrock model. And we're going to call it Chuck. And the model identifier we're going to call Chuck. And we're going to make the texture size the same dimensions as a Minecraft skin, but not the newer skins, which came out in Minecraft 1.8 or Java Edition 1.8. We're going to do the older skins where there's no sleeves or trousers, just because Chuck's skin is very flat and basic. And that is 64 pixels wide by 32 pixels high. We're going to click confirm. And now we need to create a player. Now, we could do it from scratch. We could make all of the components to make a player, which is actually pretty easy to do. Or we could do what I do and just cheat, I guess. So forget making a brand new one. We're going to actually go to File, Open Model instead. And I'm going to use the official vanilla Minecraft files that I showed you how to get in the first video. And I'm going to basically grab the model of a player. So inside the resource packs, vanilla, models, and mobs.json, you will see it comes up with all of the different geometry files within that one. And the one we're actually looking for is the custom humanoid. So there's 2 types of humanoid, humanoid custom and humanoid custom slim. That's for basically the people with the thinner arms. We want humanoid custom, so we're going to import that in here, and you can see we've already got our little character already in place. If we click on our group, our root group at the side, you'll see we've got the body materials, we've got capes and all sorts of stuff on here we don't need. We've got legs, we've got pants, we've got the whole lot. We don't need all of those things. You'll also see that our texture file is 64 by 64 and we only want it 64 by 32. So there's a few things we're going to need to do. So first thing I'm going to do is I'm actually going to export this model, and I'm going to export this Bedrock entity to where we want it in our actual files. So because this is a visual thing we're looking at, this isn't going to be going in the behavior pack, this is going to be going in the resource pack. So I'm going to locate the resource pack folder, and inside of that I'm going to put a file called models, and inside of the models I'm going to make a new folder called entity. and it's entity here, not entities. Don't ask me why, but in the resource packs, when they refer to entities, they use entity for folders, and in the behavior packs, when they refer to entities, they use entities as the folders. Doesn't make any sense. Don't know why they do that, but there we go. So we're going to open that up, and we're going to save this as chuck.json. And we're going to save that there. And the reason we've saved it there is now when we make changes to it, it's not going to affect our original vanilla file. It's going to affect that one instead. So there's a lot of things we can get rid of on here. But before we get rid of them, let's import the texture so we can see what we're doing. So I'm going to click on 64 by 64 and I'm going to change that to what I wanted it on before as 64 by 32. I'm also going to change the identifier because I don't want it to be called all of those things. I just want it to be called chuck. So I'm going to confirm that, and then I'm going to click import texture, and I'm going to put my chuck texture in there. Now at the moment we don't actually have our chuck texture in there, but fortunately I already do have my chuck texture file available. If you haven't got a skin file available, you can actually make one in Blockbench, or you can just download one from the internet, or you can make one in Photoshop, whatever you want. But we've already got ours. I'll provide that in the download, and yes, it's a horrendous looking skin. Big Chicken made it, it wasn't me, so don't blame me for how bad that looks. So I'm going to basically make another new folder in our resource packs folder. So I'm going to do that. I'm going to put textures. I'm going to hit return, and inside of textures, I'm then going to have a folder, entity. And inside of our entity folder, I'm going to grab Chuck's skin, and I'm basically going to right click and I'm going to paste it in there. So we've now got Chuck, and we're just going to call that Chuck just so that we don't get confused. So now when we open Chuck, you'll see that Chuck has almost already been textured correctly, but there's a few things that we need to sort out. First of all, we don't want Chuck to have a hat. So let's get rid of the hat folder here. He only needs a head, not a hat. Second of all, he doesn't need jackets or trousers. We can get rid of that sleeve, that jacket, and we can get rid of both of those trouser legs. So now we've got Chuck's left leg, his right leg, left arm, his right arm, and his body. There's no jackets or extra stuff. We also don't need his cape, so we can't click on that. So we're just going to delete the folder there, and we'll delete a few of these folders that no longer actually contain anything in them. So now we've got a very basic Chuck, but his skin's not quite lining up right. If we click on his arm, that is in the correct place there. His body is in the correct place there, but this arm is not. It was in the wrong place. So if we click on here, we can actually move that and make it line up where we want it. So let's put that there, and the same thing with his leg. Let's make that line up with his leg. So now you can see they're all lined up. Now, if we want to mirror that so it looks the opposite way round, we can actually click on mirror UV there, and we can have those skins or those files facing the other direction so they don't look too uniform. So there we go. We've now made Chuck. If we click on the folder that contains his left arm, you can see we can rotate the arm, and if we rotate it properly, it will actually pivot in the right place because we've stolen this basically from the game. All of the pivot points and things are right. The other thing you might notice is the left arm has a left item and the right arm has a right item, and that's got lead hold on it as well. Now that's actually an anchor that tells the game that this particular point on this entity is where we will have things attaching to when he's holding something. Now for us, Chuck's not actually going to be holding anything at all, so we're going to get rid of that right item and the left item as well, and we've got just the basics of what we need. But what's really important here is the head. The fact that we have a head and it is named head is going to tell the game that when it's looking around, looking at a player and entity, that it is his head. We want it to be his head that moves around and not something else. So that's all done. Chuck is 100% complete, ready to go. We're going to just export that again, just to make sure that we're not missing anything. So in our models entity folder, export Chuck, click save, replace it, and we're good to go. Now, if you want to make any alterations to the skin file in here, you can do that. If you click on paint instead of edit, you can come up here and you can scribble all over your creation. You can either draw it directly on the model or you can draw it over here, and then you get a little save icon there, which will allow you to actually save that. But we don't want to do that because we've just made a horrendous mess of what was already quite a horrendous mess. There is another panel here called Animate, which allows us to create animations. We're not doing animations today, that will be in an upcoming episode, but that is all fully featured as part of Blockbench, which makes our lives so much easier. So we can close Blockbench now, we don't need it anymore, and we can discard our model because we can open it up again in the future when we want to. And now what we're going to do is come back to Visual Studio Code, and we're actually going to check out what that model looks like in here. Now, coming to the file, there's a couple of interesting things going on, things that we don't want. If we scroll right down, we've actually got two versions of Chuck. Let's just make that smaller by collapsing that and that one. We've got the second Chuck that we saved, but for some reason it's kept us with the first one. We're just going to get rid of the first one. We don't need it, and we're just going to keep Chuck on its own. So we've got what we created there, geometry.chuck, and it's got all of the things that we left in. So now we have a model. We're happy we've got a model. We've got a texture, which is now in our textures folder. All we need to do now is actually create an entity file as part of the resource pack and a render controller. And the render controller is what makes Chuck look like Chuck, I guess. I don't know, it's a hard one to explain. So back on our entity folder, we're going to right click and we're going to create a new folder. And we're going to call it render controllers. And we are going to be back on the steel again. So we're going to go back to the vanilla resource packs and the vanilla resource pack. And we're just going to grab one of these render controllers and make it work the way we want to. If we check out the bat one, it's quite a simple and basic render controller. There's nothing crazy going on with there. Whereas if we was to look at the NPC one we saw earlier, there's all sorts of ones because there's different skins. Now, if we go to the villager one, because villagers can have all sorts of different skins and professions, the render controller is crazy because the render controller basically tells the game all of the different available textures and models and geometries and skins and materials that each of the entities can have. Ours is only going to have one. It needs to be very basic. So we're going to go with the cow one. And I'm going to drag the cow one over to the right hand side of our screen there, get rid of the one that's on the left. And now we need to actually make one for Chuck. So go back to our new folder that we created called render controllers, right click and hit new file. And we're going to call it chuck.json again. Oh man, we got another chuck.json. We got lots of chuck.json going on here. And I'm going to hit Control A to select all, Control C to copy it, Control V on the left hand side. And that's pretty much it, apart from we've got controller.render.cow. We're going to have that as controller.render.chuck. We're going to use default geometry, default material, and default texture. And that will all make sense, at least I hope it will make sense, in a minute. So we'll save that. We've now got a render controller. So the last but not least file that we need in order to bring Chuck into the game is his resource pack entity file, which links all of these things together. So we need another new folder. We need to right click on our resource pack root and click on new folder. And we're going to call it entity. And we're going to right click on that and do new file. And you guessed it, it's going to be called chuck.json again. Now this one's a little bit more complicated, but we're going to go back on the steel and find a very basic one to copy from. So let's close the render controllers folder from our vanilla Minecraft files and go to the entity one. And let's just check out the bat. The bat surely doesn't have too much going on. It doesn't. So we're going to, again, drag that to the right-hand side. And we're going to Control A to select, Control C to copy, click on the left, Control V to paste, and then we can get rid of that bat now. We don't need it. So we now have a whole bunch of stuff going on in this file that can control everything from what texture he has, to the model he has, to how tall he is, his scale, to the animations he has, and all of that sort of stuff. But we don't need much of it right now. The main thing we need to do is come to this identifier, and we want this identifier again to be FNT like we had before and Chuck. This has to be identical to the one we had on our behavior pack. So let's drag this to the right hand side and we'll put our behavior pack one on the left hand side. We've got FNT Chuck there on the identifier and FNT Chuck there on the identifier. That tells the game that the resource pack file is linked to this behavior pack file. You can see the format version on the left-hand side is 1.16. The one on the right-hand side is 1.8. That doesn't actually matter too much. If we go through the vanilla resource packs, even to the latest versions that actually have any entities inside and check those out, you'll see the latest version is only 1.10. And we do want to be using the 1.10 one because there is some slight differences to it. So we're going to close that player entity. We're going to come back to Chuck one and we're going to change that 1.8 to 1.10 instead. Now we've got materials, default bat. Now materials are how the game decides to render things. So for instance, a slime is semi-transparent, whereas a bat is fully transparent or fully opaque. A villager can have a hat or a mask over his face, which has a gap in, again with transparency. So the material's important for depending on what type of skin you've got. Now, Chuck has got a completely fully opaque skin. There's no transparency to it. So I'm going to give him the NPC material, which basically will work absolutely fine. If you don't know which materials to use, then again, you can come to your vanilla files and you can basically look at something similar. So let's say we're making something with semi-transparency like a slime. Let's click on the slime one and you'll see that the material there has a default material of the slime and an outer material of slime outer. Because we can actually have more than one material and more than one texture and more than one geometry per entity, which is getting a very complicated way down the line from where we are now. So let's wind it back to where we're at and let's make this nice and simple. Next, we've got textures, a default texture, which is what our render controller was looking at. So let's click back on the left-hand side render controller. Our texture here, textures, texture.default. Default here, default there. If you called that Chuck there, you would have to call that Chuck there. That is telling the render controller out of all of the textures listed in this component here to pick out the default one. We're going to leave those at default, but we do need to make sure that this texture is actually linked to where Chuck is, which is almost right. Textures / entity / bat is not quite right. It's actually textures / entity / Chuck. Now, technically, it has got .png on the end, but we don't need the file extensions on here. It will work without. Now, geometry is exactly the same thing. We've got default there and we've got default there. So again, if we change that default to something else and that to something else, it would still work, but we're going to leave it on default. But we don't want geometry bat. We actually want geometry Chuck. So basically what we're doing with this is we're saying that geometry Chuck is known as our default geometry, and using the render controller, we're telling it to pick the default geometry. Again, we could have a circumstance where we've got two different geometries for this entity, and depending on what happened with it, or whether it's being animated or whether it's being interacted with, we could actually change that entity model during the game to reflect that change. So let's say we decided we were going to make an entity that when you punched him, his arm fell off. We could take away his arm by basically choosing a different model that didn't include the arm and switching to that when that entity took damage. We're not going to do that, but I'm just explaining to you why that exists. So the next one, we've got scripts, animation controllers. All those are useless to us now because we've changed the format version. We don't need them anyway because we're not doing any animation in today's episode. We're going to delete those, and that leaves us render controllers, which is probably the most important one because that's actually then going to link to this new render controller we've created. If we don't link that up, it doesn't know where to look for the materials and it's all going to be wrong. So we're going to copy and paste controller.render.chuck to controller.render.bat there and get rid of that, linking those two files together. So now our resource pack entity is linked to all of those other resource pack files and the behavior pack entity as well. And there's one more thing on here which could be quite useful to us, and that's a spawn egg. Now, for spawn eggs, you can either have a completely custom texture, or you can use an existing spawn egg in the game. For instance, if we again look at the cow entity, you'll see that the spawn egg has the texture spawn egg and the texture index 1, whereas a creeper spawn egg has the texture index 6. The texture index for the spawn egg is the different colors of the spawn egg. But we don't want Chuck to have the standard spawn egg texture. We want to give him his own unique texture. So we're going to get rid of the texture index and the comma that leads down to it, and we're going to change the texture to Chuck item. And the reason why calling it that is because we want it to be different from the normal skin file. We don't want to use the skin file as the texture. We need to do that. And that Chuck item texture doesn't actually exist in the game anywhere. So we're going to have to now link to yet another file that isn't a list of item textures within the game. But before we go down that complicated rabbit hole, let's just step back a second and put that spawn egg texture back in and just check that everything we've done so far is actually going to work. So I'm going to launch Minecraft and I'm going to add this pack to a brand new world, and you will see that we will get some errors, which is absolutely fine. I'm expecting to because we're not finished. So first of all, before I start anything, I'm going to go to settings and profile and make sure that my enable content log file and enable content log GUI is selected so that we can see any errors that do occur. I'm going to come back out of that, go to play and create a new world. And I'm going to call the world 3 for the third video in this series, and I'm going to call it entity because this is the entity video. We're going to go into creative. We're going to have it on peaceful so we're not bothered by mobs, and we're just going to make a flat world. And I'm going to scroll right down to turn mob spawning off just so that it's just me and Chuck in this world. I'm turning multiplayer off so I don't get a load of randoms joining while I'm trying to record a video. And now I can go to behavior packs, my packs, and click on activate entity basics, which is the one we're creating today, and click continue. Now, hopefully if I've done everything right, when I go to resource packs and active, that will have gone in there as well, which it has. So now I can click create. And this is where I expect to see at least one error, which I didn't see, which is very surprising. So maybe something's changed, but there should have been at least. So now if I go to my creative menu and type in Chuck, you'll see I have item.spawnegg.entity.fnt.chuck.name. So we have a Chuck spawn egg in the game. And if I click on that and go to click that on the ground, we should find ourselves with a Chuck, which should hopefully, if we've done things right, turn his head to look at us. Now, at the moment, he's turning his whole body, which is absolutely fine. We're not going to worry about that too much now, but he is turning to look at us. Now, if I put another entity in the game, he might choose to look at that instead of looking at me because we've given him the probability that he can look at an entity as well as at us. Now, he might not. He might just keep his eyes on me because basically I've told him that that's the top priority thing to do, but he could also choose to look at that dog, or he just might look around the world on his own. So let's go a distance from him and see if any of that actually works. He's looking at the dog. You can see him there looking at the dog, and now he's just having a random look around. And if we go a little bit closer, he's then going to lock onto us. So that's working pretty much exactly as I wanted it to, and he will take damage as well. So let's grab ourselves a sword and let's chop him to bits. And there you go. Chuck has died. He didn't drop anything because he's got no loot table, and we didn't get a Chuck back. Now, we don't have any way of despawning him yet. We've got no way of spawning him in the game naturally. We can use the summon command. And if we do summon FNC Chuck there like that, we can get another one. And that is it. That's all working. But we don't want the spawn egg to be named item.spawnegg.entity.chuck. And we don't want basically the spawn egg to look like a cow spawn egg. So let's fix all of that. We're going to come out of Minecraft now. And we're going to close pretty much most of these files we've got to clean things up a little bit. We're going to shrink some of these folders down so it's not quite so messy. And the one we're going to be looking at the most is the one inside our entity folder, which is the last one we were working on. So we're going to double click that so it stays open. We're also going to click on our textures folder, and we want a new folder in there. So we're going to right click textures. Notice that this has combined the two folders in there. There's two folders there. There's textures, then entity, but because there's nothing else in there, it's actually put them on the same line. So make sure we're clicking on textures and not entity. And we're going to click new folder, and we're going to call it items. And then in the items folder, we just need a new little graphic, which is a 16 by 16 pixel graphic that signifies that Chuck is Chuck. So using Photoshop or any other program you want, I'm going to create a 16 by 16 pixel file, which is very, very small, but that's how big item files are in Minecraft. You can build bigger ones, or you can do bigger ones, which will become higher res in the game, but I like to give things the same look as the default game. And I'm also going to drag in Chuck's skin file here, because all I'm going to do is just grab his face. Now, Chuck's face is actually 8 by 8 pixels. So if I copy and paste that into here, you'll see it's actually quite small. So I'm going to put a little bit of a border around his face as well. And I'm going to do that basically by double clicking the background and then just shrinking that background to fit around it. So the background is maybe 10 by 10 or maybe 12 by 12, giving it a little border around his face like that. And now I can just save that as a little item that says, hey, this item is Chuck. The reason I've made it smaller than 16 by 16 because 16 by 16 is the full item slot, and having a full size item in your item slot looks a little bit weird. So I'm going to save this, but this time I need to go to my development resource packs folder, my entity folder, my textures folder, and the new one we called items. And here we're going to call it Chuck _ item. And I'm going to do the PNG file, and I'm going to save that, and I'm going to save it as the smallest file size, and then we can get rid of Photoshop again. So now in our items folder, we do have the Chuck item, and we now need to link that into our Chuck entity. Now, it's not the same linking it here as it is our default texture. So our default texture actually says, hey, pick this texture, which is in this folder inside this folder. It doesn't work like that for item graphics in Minecraft. For whatever reason, you've actually got to list them in a different file. And the file we need is something in our textures folder. If we right click on that and do new file, and it's called item_texture.json. So now when we open that up, it's going to be blank. And yes, again, we're going to copy and paste from the Minecraft vanilla file. So we're going to open up our data one again, go back to resource packs, and we're going to go down to any of the resource packs that contains items. We'll just go for the plain vanilla one. We're going to go into the textures folder, and down here, you'll see one called item texture. Again, I'm going to drag it over to the right-hand side. We don't need we hardly need any of this stuff. We only need a little bit. So all I'm going to do is going to hit Control A to highlight it all, Control C to copy it, click to the left, click Control V to paste it. And then I'm going to drag pretty much most of this away. That's all of the textures in the Minecraft game. We're only dealing with one texture here, so I can pretty much get rid of everything. So I'm going to get rid of everything, including that last comma, and we're going to change this. So now we're going to call this Chuck Item. And that Chuck Item is the same name as our PNG file, although it doesn't have to be. It can be any name of our PNG file, but this Chuck Item here is what we're going to have next to texture here. So we're going to get rid of texture index again. We're going to get rid of that comma and put the Chuck Item there. So now this is telling this file to link to our item textures file and find Chuck Item there. Now the resource pack name is not vanilla because we're not working on the vanilla resource pack. So we're going to put FNT there, the namespace we've used before. And now all we got to do is tell this texture to link to our actual image, just like we did back on here. We've got default textures, entity Chuck. This one we're going to have textures, items, and then Chuck Item. So that's telling the game that this item picture here is linked to this, which links to that. It's a very convoluted and complicated way of doing things, but now Chuck will have the actual picture item rather than the other thing. Now, the reason I said I thought we were going to get an error is because there's one more file that we really should be adding in, and that is another file very similar to this item texture file. What we're going to do is we're going to go to our textures folder again, and we're going to right click on it, click new file, and we're going to call it textures_list.json. I'm going to click on that, and again we're going to copy and paste. So going down to our vanilla packs, we're going to go to the textures.list file there, drag it over to the right hand side so we can see what we're doing with it. And basically this is a list of every single block, entity, item, and texture in the game, including a lot of the UI stuff as well, so that the game can preload those textures into memory so that it's not having to call it up every time you look at an entity and basically causing lag while you're playing. And again, we only need 2 rows of this. So I'm going to start with my square brackets, and I'm going to put these in manually. The first one, I'm going to put in the texture for the entity and then for the item. So we're going to do textures, which is the folder where it is, entity, and then Chuck, which is our main one, and then a comma, then textures, items, and Chuck Item, which is our item file. And that's it. That's all we need to do there. Save that, get rid of that, and now the game can preload those graphics without causing lag to the game every time we look at Chuck. So now if we go back into the game and go back into our world, bear in mind we're using the development behavior packs and development resource packs folders, so it's automatically going to update that. We don't need to create a new UID. You can see we now have Chuck's face on the item instead of the spawn egg, which looks a lot better in my opinion. And that's it. Nothing else has changed. We still need to do the texts, which is really, really simple. Item.spawnegg.entity.fnt:chuck.name, which is a bit of a mouthful. So again, let's come out of Minecraft. We're going to go back to our text files that we created in the last episode, but only in the resource packs folder. So in the resource packs folder, you'll see I've got one called texts, and we've got one here called enuslang, and that's where our pack name and pack description names are. So now all we've got to do is type in what we've just seen in game and put that here. So item.spawnegg.entity.fnt:chuck.name. And if we put an equal there, we can put Chuck next to that, and that's going to replace anything in the game it finds with that string with the word Chuck. So we're going to save that and go back into our world, and hopefully this time, if I've remembered it correctly, that we should get here Chuck. There we go. Now, these ones are not going to be called Chuck. These are actually going to have a name as well, which you'll probably never see unless one kills you and it comes up in a death message, but we should probably give that a name as well. And we can do that with exactly the same process. And going back to our text files, all we need is entity.fnt:chuck.name, and that is going to be Chuck as well. And that basically says that the actual entities themselves in the game are called Chuck and not this weird string instead. So that means if you ever see Chuck referenced by the game, it will refer to it as Chuck and not this string here. And that's it. Job done. The pack is finished. And as much as at this point in the development cycle, Chuck's not doing a great deal other than standing there looking around. He's got no animations. He can't walk. He can't move. He can't do a great deal. We will be adding all of those things to him over the next few episodes. If you enjoyed this video, please do leave a like because it really does help the channel. And if you really enjoyed it and you want to see more, then check out FoxyNoTail.com/how-to and subscribe to this channel. Anyway, that is pretty much it from me. I'll see you all in the next one. Goodbye.